Hi everyone, today I'd figured we examine the work environment in Swedish government institutions. And if you're wondering why my arm is broken, you're clearly not getting all my uploads, so look in the video description for more info on that. A team of independent researchers conducted a study into our crime council and discovered that employees are often pressured into changing their results due to political reasons. Former employees testified to a widespread silence culture dictated by whoever is currently head of the Justice Department. One interview subject testifies saying that if management didn't like the result of a particular study, they would pressure you into changing it to something more positive. Oh, how Swedish and agreeable. Asking you to tone down parts of your findings while overemphasizing others' more mitigating factors. In that sense, it's a more passive form of censorship rather than the outwardly brutal censorship engaged in by well-known regimes. Just like you would expect from a feminist society. Another interview subject shared their story of how they were called up to the Justice Department once for a conversation, and they were surprised by the demands that the report be corrected.
But I corrected them, sir.
This since it evaluated the government's proposals as damaging. The employee in question knew that their findings might be politically unpopular, but proceeded with their report anyway, and this became the result. Most insanely, these kind of pressure tactics are often justified by saying, and I quote, "There is a reality, and then there is a political reality." Okay, well, maybe don't get your moral philosophy from the bad guy in a George Orwell novel, because there's just a whole lot of 1984 sprinkled on top there. The researchers of the Crime Institute that were interviewed for this study give many more examples to show how they've been pressured with their reports. In one case, they did a study on violent crime, showing that the most severe kinds of crime had increased. But the publication was stalled because of its politically sensitive content. This so the release wouldn't coincide with the upcoming election. Okay, well that sounds a lot like China! Sweden's Crime Council is just one of many government agencies controlled in highly socialist fashion. Let's not forget the incident with the Migration Board before an election, where the government forced them to delay a sensitive report as well, onto a Sunday right before the election, meaning they wanted as few people as possible to see it, so that leftists wouldn't suffer votes. Another example is Sweden's police. Veteran former cop and whistleblower revealed in his new book that police chiefs manipulate statistics and reports that are presented to the public. Are you noticing a pattern yet? This is pretty easy to figure out just by looking at various press statements. For example, abnormal amount of car fires right now. Police attribute this increase to nice weather. And they expect us to believe this. He also confirmed the existence of so-called stick hunting. You see, ever since Sweden took on a crisis of rape and resource deficit, our government ordered the police to prioritize simple crimes ahead of complex crimes. What this means is that feminist social democrats told cops to chase stoners and traffic violations instead of rapes and murders, which are harder to solve and require more resources. But by prioritizing in the most amoral fashion conceivable, they can bump up the clearance statistics and make it look like more crimes are being solved. Make it look like the government is doing a great job, when all that's really happening is that petty crimes are being prioritized while our most horrible crimes are being ignored. All while rape victims can't find justice in feminist Sweden, and the numbers are just piling up. It's magic, you see, a trick of illusion, and a great example of why you can't trust statistics to understand reality. Numbers alone are not enough. They have to be understood through context. So as you can see, Sweden lies about everything, because that's how you maintain a utopia. That's what Swedish morality is based upon. Relativism and conformity ahead of principle, which might be the more agreeable thing to do, but it certainly shows why you need those annoying assholes that make people uncomfortable with the truth. Subscribe to our link in bio. Most annoyingly, Swedes act obnoxiously proud of how superior their democracy and institutions allegedly are to the entire rest of the world. A professor in the Department of Government told the local, "There is a very high level of confidence amongst Swedish citizens towards authorities and the government. There's a strong idea in Sweden that civil servants should be safeguarded from the pressures that come from the political side. It lives on, and I think it's done what it was meant to do. There is very little corruption in Sweden." End of quote. Then, as an example, they give the government's handling of the corona crisis, since a lot of people were confused as who's actually responsible. And that's the way it typically works with bureaucracy and big government, so I'll read and you'll get a deeper understanding of how Sweden's fake democracy works. It's written into the national constitution that Sweden's public agencies are independent of the government. There are two main goals to this. One is ensuring that decisions are made based on knowledge and expertise. And two is limiting corruption, because ministers cannot have influence in agency decision-making. Sounds nice, doesn't it? A minister who tries to issue direct commands to an agency on how to handle a specific issue, whether it's an individual case or day-to-day decision-making, could find themselves accused of ministerial rule by political opponents. Overruling government agencies or disregarding their advice is usually seen as politically risky, even though it's not specifically forbidden in most circumstances. Ooh, what a taboo! Jesus Christ. See, this is just too bureaucratic to function. This is why you need to differentiate between words and actions, theory and practice. In theory, to the casual observer, this sounds like a wonderfully democratic idea. The government can't control what departments consisting of experts do, so there's diversity in government. A department can go against the state if they're wrong, and common sense can come out on top. Yippity! This system works! But what happens in practice is that the experts are often morons and partisan suck-ups to whatever party is in charge, because otherwise their career would suffer. See, that's how you keep good corruption going. Don't put it into the legislation, make it a social lubricant instead, and apply pressure. In the case of corona, Sweden's so-called expert claimed it wouldn't spread outside of China, refused to issue a travel ban that would have prevented it reaching Sweden altogether, argued that kids can't get it, and refused to close schools. Schools are still not closed for 1 million students. They're also claiming it's not contagious unless you have symptoms, long after every other country and global institutions have recognized the opposite. As a result, deaths increased by 138% in just a week, and Sweden is now being lambasted internationally, being the only country outside of China to produce whistleblower doctors. If you compare Sweden to its neighboring countries, we are doing exceptionally bad with a several times higher death rate. Also, a third of Stockholm's elderly homes are now infected because they didn't bother issuing visitation restrictions until April 1st, after hundreds had died. While over 100 countries have issued full or partial lockdowns, Sweden is just engaging in human sacrifice, while at the same time acting smarter than everyone else. So that's the expert-based democracy that Swedes are so proud of. One where official state experts go against common sense. And then they claim that this is somehow more democratic because the government can't intervene. But it's all government. I mean, there's no separation in practice. And this is not giving you a higher quality of politicians, it's just letting them escape without responsibility. Swedish public agencies and various departments change their staff about as often as a new government gets elected, so this is the pattern I've noticed, and this applies to both left and right. Number 1, hire their own instead of hiring based on competence. Number 2, something goes wrong. Number 3, they blame each other even though they stood united in the beginning and took the same stance. Number 4, pagan blood ritual ensues where the public frolics over a metaphorical media fire where the lowest standing member of the hierarchy gets sacrificed. Number 5, after the human sacrifice, the public is content and happy when a false sense of responsibility spread amongst the herd. Even though the person responsible left their job for the mandatory parachute, meaning that a severance fee of 1 million crowns or more. Even when a politician gets Me Too'd in Sweden, they're fired with 5 million in the pocket, while others who casually jeopardized national security just get rehired in a different position. And finally, number 6. The cycle continues with every government, since state-worshipping Swedes have about as good memory as a goldfish. So it's really just a charade, this idea that there's a separation between government and government. See, if you make the wording more honest, it kind of gives you a better idea of what's happening. See what I did there, Sven? Government workers work for the government, who pays their salary. And so you'll never see too much difference in opinion going on. The circle of nepotism reflects the dangers of big government, meaning that when you have too big of a government, too many assholes can fit inside. And they can sort of always get away by blaming anything that goes wrong on each other. Any alleged corruption becomes hard to investigate since everyone tends to get tangled in with each other when sitting in this big government together. Too many departments mean too many responsibilities. So ultimately, everyone and no one is responsible. Especially no one. And that's the real purpose of Sweden's national constitution. State agencies are only separated from the state so the state can maintain a better image. And lo and behold, our Prime Minister is now blaming the state expert for tons of deaths and nothing being done sooner, despite him standing by that expert's ideas all this time. As I mentioned earlier, there's no real consequences for politicians here. They don't go to jail, they just live happily forever after at the taxpayer's expense. If someone actually manages to get fired, they're just rewarded with a severance fee or rehired. And Swedes don't care, because they love their superior state so much, big mommy government, that they just like it. They think it's normal. Well, I think it's a global incest village. Na zdrowie! To get back to the Crime Council, the researchers further described the Swedish work environment as following. Quote, numerous employees expressed frustrations during an incident where a higher-up kept changing the conclusions of their report because they were politically insensitive. And while researchers were gathering data for the report, the higher-up commented in connection to a media debate, saying publicly that a new study was pointless, since the data from the last time was still valid. But this simply wasn't true, as there had been vast changes in context, demographics, and legislation since then. Central changes to drawing a conclusion on the issue. End of quote. This is just one of many examples given in this study, and the researchers at Linköping's University concluded that our crime council isn't trustworthy. I wonder what they would think of any other state department with similar anecdotes, but I guess there's just too many to investigate by this point. One person also testified saying that there appears to be a preference for hiring young girls that are deemed easily controllable, instead of independent scientists and professors. This because it's harder for the Crime Council to control well-educated, strong-minded scientists that don't want to be controlled. End of quote. And all of this has been entirely obvious to me since I started up my channel. In fact, I even correctly estimated migrant overrepresentation years before our state media did. Years before the mainstream stated the obvious, or any new report was made, because the old findings were enough to draw coherent conclusions from. For over a decade, Swedes have acted like this was a great taboo issue, when Denmark, Norway, and Finland already had a bunch of statistics clearly showing what specific ethnicities are overrepresented with surprise sex. But Swedes didn't even bother looking outside of their own country. So maybe you're more self-centered than Americans. I wanted to make a joke about how nobody in this country knows how to use the internet, but I'm starting to think that they don't want to know. Because I've been presenting study sources for years, and all that got me in this country was a bunch of ugly labels. What's funny here is that for the longest time, Sweden refused to update the research on immigration and crime. The latest one they did was in 2005, and since then both left and right have refused an update. Most recently we had a socialist minister in 2017 saying, and I quote, "When you check for socio-economical factors, the overrepresentation disappears near entirely." End of quote. Not only is this a blatant lie, but the very same report referenced in this article drew the opposite conclusion. The overrepresentation remains after checking for those specific factors. But of course, Swedish state media wouldn't question the state in any way that truly matters. Now, they've decided differently. In 2019, a report was ordered whose results are due to be published in 2021. But what I found most profound is that for 15 years, they literally got away with saying, "Nah, we don't feel like it." Now, call me a peasant if you'd wish, but seems to me like that's kinda yellow. Looks like you be hiding something. And I don't trust no man that be hiding something. You think you're better than me, boy? It's common sense. The way you interact with people reflects the way you should act with your government, and you would never trust someone who's unable to back up their statements otherwise. So it's all just really weird to me, because if you're genuinely convinced that there is no overrepresentation, why wouldn't you want to get that on paper? So you can have an official report to shove in your opponent's faces and prove to everyone beyond reasonable doubt how wrong and pesky those evil conservatives are. But that's a pretty unique perspective to have here in Sweden, because state worship is the culture here, meaning that people show a way bigger respect for the government than they show towards each other. And that's really Sweden's biggest problem when you get down to it all, the snob culture. I really think that's what shaped me to become such an edgelord, because you get really impatient with the consistent social pattern of people valuing fancy words and exterior more than what's actually true and provable. As a result, I am living in a country where people are constantly impressed by the wrong things. The fact that it takes an official report for a Sven to think differently than their government shows how clueless the majority are. Because up until someone official puts it in official fancy language, they'll just blindly trust the word of whatever authority figure is looking to get off. My belief has always been that if you're a truly observant citizen, then you'll notice what's wrong in your society way before some tedious academic does. And it's truly frightening how much PC culture will mess a people up. So I guess the conclusion here is that Sweden is the China of Europe.